Welcome to I Need to Know Show, a production of the Public Trust Network. This show was created to inform Americans about the concerns and particular needs of the Puerto Rican community throughout the United States. However, our audience is not Puerto Ricans. Rather, the American public at large, who actually have the power that Puerto Ricans do not have. That is, to decide if Puerto Rico can be treated equally as all Americans under the Constitution. What, you may ask? This is not my opinion. This is what the United States Supreme Court has stated in several court decisions over the years. Many of you have heard of Puerto Rico, but many Americans do not even know where it is. What is sad to note is ever since World War I, Puerto Ricans have fought in every conflict around the world to support this nation and its principles of freedoms enshrined in the Constitution. Puerto Ricans have fought in Korea, Kuwait, Iraq, and around the world so that these people have the right to vote in a democracy of their making for their nation. Yet, Puerto Ricans on the island cannot vote themselves for their president or to have a voting voice in the Congress that sends them to war. In fact, the Supreme Court of the United States has clearly stated that Puerto Rico is governed by what is called the Territorial Clause of the Constitution and is governed by Congress. And Congress controls what rights and privileges apply to Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans on the island. The Equal Protection Clause, which covers you and me, does not apply to Puerto Ricans on the island. This program is designed to educate Americans on this issue and to create a national platform for stateside Puerto Ricans to discuss this issue and bring it to their senators and congressmen. Puerto Ricans on the island are American citizens, but are not treated like American citizens. We do not advocate for statehood or independence. That is for the citizens of the island to determine. But we Americans do have a voice on how our Constitution is applied. Hello, everybody. This is Tony Suarez on I Need to Know Radio from the Public Trust Network. And today we have a very distinguished guest, Jose Fuentas Agostini, former the Attorney General of Puerto Rico, a gentleman who's been spent his entire life, obviously, not just in Puerto Rico, but advocating for Puerto Rico. And he's actually stationed in Washington, D.C., where he does actual lobbying on behalf of many issues, but certainly one it has to do with Puerto Rico. I know Jose for many, many years, who supported all the events that I've ever put together when I was president of the Puerto Rican Bar Association of Florida, an advocate for Puerto Rico's position on statehood. And today we're going to explore many issues that have to do with Puerto Rico and the diaspora. And I know many people don't like the word diaspora, but it's a word we have to use because we now know that there are more Puerto Ricans or people who identify themselves as Puerto Rican outside of Puerto Rico than they are Puerto Ricans on the island. And if that's the case,
more than double.
That's right. Right. So what's important, and as I indicated in our introduction video to this, the Puerto Rico cannot have a vote on itself. It cannot help itself in this situation because it doesn't have congressmen and it doesn't have representatives that can vote on committees and cannot control the budget. A good example of this is how Senator Tuberville in Alabama can stop the entire federal government on the promotion of all the generals because one senator decides that this is what his priority is. Imagine if Puerto Rico had a senator who could stop the entire federal budget until there was an equation, for example, in the formulas that are given federal funding to Puerto Rico. This is a tremendous power. Of course, from our point of view, I'm going to repeat this. We here, La Diaspora, on this show, will not advocate for Puerto Rico's independence or for Puerto Rico statehood. We're just going to bring the facts, all right? And the facts are what the facts are. Puerto Rico certainly has the right to be an independent nation if it wants to. Puerto Rico has, I believe, has the right to become a state if it wants to. We're going to state the facts. I, as a Puerto Rican of now literally third generation, because my parents, grandparents left Puerto Rico in 1920. My grandfather voted with his feet, as they say, and moved to New York, 1920. And my mother was born in 1931 in New York. And of course, I was born in 1953 in New York. And so we're quite a few generations, but nonetheless, there are many of us, millions, literally over 5 million persons who identify themselves as Puerto Ricans, who have an affiliation to the island, care about the island, and care about what happens to the island. So this show is about reaching out, bringing out the facts, and interviewing everybody and see what in fact can be done. But if we don't talk about it, nothing will be done. So our effort here is, of course, is to do something by talking. So I was interested in preparation for this interview with you, Jose. I looked at some of the demographics of Puerto Rico. And there's a slide I want to, I don't know if you can see the slide. Slide one, it has to do with the drop in Puerto Rico, or the change in Puerto Rico from the point of 1910 to the current. So we have, at its height, Puerto Rico had about 3.8 million people, and now it's estimated at 3.1. So a drop of about 650,000 people. That is a tremendous drop in population. With that being said, there are two other graphs that I will show you, but we'll get to it as we go along. I was wondering if you could give us an estimation. You're an expert in the field, obviously know the insides out politically of Puerto Rico. What does this mean for Puerto Rico?
Well, Tony, it means that Puerto Rico is getting poorer because the people that are leaving the island are those people who can find a job once they get to the mainland. So the people who are not as well educated, who can't really advance their quality of life by leaving the island, are staying on the island unless they have a necessity that would be covered by federal government handouts in a state, but not on the island. So those are the two groups that are really leaving the island. The latest numbers from the census reflect that there's over 6 million people that identify as Puerto Ricans living on the mainland, and only 3 million on the island. So it's more than double that are throughout the generations, like you mentioned, grown the amount of people from Puerto Rico, and we've become the second largest Hispanic group in the continent, right? The Mexicans have the largest group. Puerto Ricans are the second largest group. Cubans are the third largest group. So all this is creating political power. Now, part of the reason why this is happening is because the Supreme Court of the United States in 1922 derailed Puerto Rico from following a track, right? Up till then, if you were granted U.S. citizenship, which happened to Puerto Rico in 1917, that would put you on the road to statehood. You would become an incorporated territory. 100 years ago, the Supreme Court stuck its hands into the political arena, creating this mess because it said Puerto Rico, although they've been granted U.S. citizenship, U.S. Congress wasn't clear enough that they were getting on the road to statehood and becoming an incorporated territory. Of course, 32 territories before Puerto Rico became states and never had that signaled by the U.S. Congress. So now the Supreme Court is saying, well, this is a political issue, we can't get involved. but it's a political issue that they created, and the Supreme Court should step in and fix it. So what we're seeing in the demographics is that in that 1922 opinion, the Supreme Court said, you can get full U.S. citizenship if you move to a state. And that's what opened the door. So the Supreme Court is saying the only way you can have full statehood benefits and citizenship benefits is if you move to a state. And that opened the door. The first big migration was from the 1920s to the 1950s. Most of those people went to New York, where we now have 1 million Puerto Ricans living. Then the second big migration came in the 70s when Disney World determined that they needed Hispanics who spoke English and Spanish, who could work for the minimum wage in their new park in Orlando and didn't have an immigration problem, a visa problem. Where could you find that employee? Puerto Rico. They recruited heavily in Puerto Rico at the universities and everywhere else. And now we have 1.2 million Puerto Ricans living in Florida.
Yeah. Now, and of course, you've brought together a bunch of issues together because to this day, they're still recruiting in Puerto Rico. I know that recently the Orange County Sheriff's Office was out there in Puerto Rico recruiting policemen. I don't know how many doctors' offices have opened up here in Central Florida with Puerto Rican doctors. Where I go, every single one of the 17 doctors that are part of that group are from Puerto Rico. It's almost an amazing thing. So that you're losing your staff.
It's not only teachers, nurses, doctors, policemen going that are getting recruited. The Evangelical Church of the United States has the same problem that Disney had 50 years ago, because the evangelical movement is growing by leaps and bounds, mostly because of Hispanics joining the religious movement, and they are recruiting ministers in Puerto Rico, right, because they can find very good, capable, well-educated ministers who don't have immigration issues.
So we're going to get into these other questions now, but I just would like to say, how do you solve this? How do you solve the problem of the brain drain? That we're taking out that young people. There's the loss of opportunity because it's get a better pay, get a better Medicaid reimbursement rates in Florida than you could do in Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico is losing its population. How do you turn this thing around? If you don't, what happens?
Well, there's only one way to turn it around, and that is to improve local economic conditions. You have to create better jobs. You have to create better paying jobs. You have to improve the education system of the island, and you have to figure out how to bring back all the manufacturing power that we lost. The problem is that Congress changes every 2 years. So we don't have a sustainable economic development model that we can hang on to, because as Congress changes, different opinions come to Congress, and sometimes they determine we're going to give Puerto Rico this, we're going to take away this from Puerto Rico. Another Congress comes, we're going to institute this tax gimmick to help Puerto Rico, and then the next Congress says we're going to take it away. So there is no way to predict what the applicable laws are going to be, because like you said, Congress enacts laws every day that apply to Puerto Rico, and we don't vote for them. So it's very hard.
So this is important for those, again, Puerto Rican people who are not of Puerto Rican descent, or even those that are of Puerto Rican descent but just were trained in New York. Like I always say to people, I learned a lot about the Algonquins. I never learned anything about the Taínos. So I had to self-teach myself that. But Puerto Rico is governed by the cases that you have just indicated, insular cases. by the territorial clause. It's governed by the which means by Supreme Court interpretation, Congress has total control of of Puerto Rico, what applies and what does not apply, so that what you just indicated, the change in the law changes with whatever Congress wants to change. If there was a more permanent position that Puerto Rico had, it could stop these types of changes. Am I correct?
That is absolutely correct. So what we need is a model, right? But in the horizon right now, there is going to be a huge opportunity to solve this, because Puerto Rico under Promesa, where you may hate it, you may love it, you may feel indifferent, but the reality is that if we didn't have Promesa, Puerto Rico would have been bankrupt, and the companies to whom Puerto Rico owed money would have taken all their assets, and there'd be nothing left. So this law, at least, is helping Puerto Rico get its financials in order and restructure its debt. We're about 2/3 of the way there. So there's another, third to go, but I think it's going to get done. And when it gets done, and we finally get all the influx of federal money rolling into construction and actually making a difference, there's going to be an opportunity to really improve the economic future of Puerto Rico. And that's going to be indispensable no matter what political status Puerto Rico chooses. But so it's especially going to be important if we want to become a state.
So it's clear. Now that you gave me a perfect segue to introduce the concept of what we are doing here in Orlando with the Legal Services Clinic, is we're having actually a convention of bar associations. We invited bar associations from throughout the United States, that is Puerto Rican bar associations, in order to have a platform nationally to discuss precisely these issues. And we're having seminars on by different professors, experts, to discuss these issues. So for those of you who want to know more about Puerto Rico, who are interested, please plug in to this network. So we're going to be continuing this series of discussions. And if you've got the ability to want to do a small vacation in Orlando and enjoy our Central Florida hospitality and learn about Puerto Rico, you can come here, take the classes. Particularly for those lawyers, there are continuing legal education credits, up to 6 credits that you will receive. But we'll be discussing this type of stuff in detail. So when you go back home and you talk to your mom and you talk to your brother and you talk to your neighbors, you'll have the facts with you. So with that perfect segue, let's go into, without getting lost in the weeds. You know what? We as lawyers, sometimes we talk and we forget that people have to speak nice English so that we get understood. But you made certain references about the unincorporated, incorporated, and you made reference to the what we call the insular cases. So let's just break this down. How does become a state? Because there's some controversy. I mean, I went back and looked at the history of Tennessee when Tennessee broke away from North Carolina, and George Washington just said, "Okay, we'll make you a state," and that's it. They made themselves a state. There wasn't plebiscites. There wasn't vote. There wasn't much of all the stuff that you hear about Puerto Rico, that we have 100 plebiscites and it's up and down and who knows. So what would it take for Puerto Rico to be a state or to claim its independence?
So there is a founding document of the Republic called the Northwest Ordinance. And that is the process that Congress established to bring in states as we were expanding to the West. 32 territories and 1 republic, Texas, became states following that process. And what that process says is that Congress determines, right, who becomes a state, and it's an up or down vote in Congress. There's an admission bill filed, and Congress says yes or no. In the history of the Northwest Ordinance, Congress would sponsor referendums. Sometimes the people voted against becoming a state but Congress wanted the territory as a state, so they made them a state. So that was the process that was followed, and that's how we expanded from the 13 original colonies and the 3 states that separated from other states and the 33 that became later to get to 50. And that is the process that Congress has established. Now, Puerto Rico is a little different because Puerto Rico falls squarely under the territorial clause of the U.S. Constitution, which you mentioned, and then the Treaty of Peace after the War of 1898, the Spanish-American War, states that only the U.S. Congress can determine the political future of the peoples living on the island.
So it will require an act of Congress in order for Puerto Rico to become a state or to leave the union altogether. Is that correct?
Correct. Only Congress can determine that.
Okay. Now, there's been a lot of debates. We've had these plebiscites on Puerto Rico, with different results and so forth. But there's also the question, which leads into what we started. It was the number of Puerto Ricans that are outside of the island. Should the island of Puerto Rico have the voice of the people in the diaspora who are living outside participate in any exercise, statehood or independence?
Well, 2 points on that. First of all, I think it would be unmanageable. There's no real way to ascertain who living outside of Puerto Rico would have the right to vote. So it would make it very difficult to manage. Second, it wouldn't be fair for the people who stayed on the island and are still there. They're the ones that are going to be impacted by the decision, not the ones who voted with their feet, as you said, and moved to a state. So I think that democracy and morality dictate that it should only be the people of Puerto Rico living on the island of Puerto Rico who have a right to vote be voting in this referendum.
All right. So, and there's a concept that I've often entertained. The question is, as Americans that live on the mainland, we have vested interest in maintaining our democracy and our Constitution. There is this status, this independent, in the middle status, of which is commonly called a Commonwealth, right? It's neither statehood nor it is independence, but it allows for Puerto Rico to have some sort of presence, some sort of independence, a sort of hybrid status, which for Puerto Ricans like myself from New York, our battle, and I was a civil rights, 1960s, 70s battle for right. We want to have a vote. We want representation. It was very hard for me to try to understand the concept that it's okay. I'm fine. I don't need to have a representation in Congress. You can do with us what you like. That was very hard for me to try to understand. It's still hard for me to understand. And sometimes I want to say to the Puerto Ricans who tell me that they like it the way it is to say, well, I don't like it. And I'm an American, and I don't think that we can have that kind of a status under our formal Constitution. What's your reflection on that?
Well, the basis of American democracy, as explained in the Declaration of Independence, is that government needs to be with the consent of the governed. That was the whole concept, right? There's no king, there's no power that nobody understands that is going to rule us. We're going to be ruled by the consent of the governed. The governed are going to decide who governs them. That's the whole breakaway from England and the United Kingdom, and creates the first real democracy in the world, which is the system that everybody wants to copy. Puerto Ricans fight in every war, go abroad and get killed, bringing to other countries democracy that they don't have at home. Because the government that Puerto Rico has now does not have the consent of the governed. And it doesn't have it for various reasons. One, because we don't vote for President of the United States. Two, because we don't vote for members of Congress. We have no valid representation in Congress with the right to vote. And third, because on 4 occasions now, the people of Puerto Rico have rejected the present relationship they have with the United States and want something different. So the consent of the governed has been withdrawn. There is no consent by Puerto Ricans to be governed the way they are being governed now.
And, again, adding to that is the question is whether or not we as Americans, those of us who are outside, whether you don't have to be Puerto Rican, you're an American citizen, the Constitution is your Constitution. And right now it would appear safe to say, because the Supreme Court has indicated that Puerto Rico is basically non-sovereign. Let's use the language Supreme Court has said. And so far, Puerto Rico is not enjoying all the benefits that every American citizen has. And therefore, we as Americans are participating in a system that seems to be unjust and unfair. So I leave it with that for those of us who want to think about that, because everyone has a vested interest in what's happening in Puerto Rico, not just Puerto Ricans. And not just people of Puerto Rican descent. Everybody who's an American, who has a right to vote, who believes in American democracy and no taxation without representation. You believe in these things? Oh, there's something going on over here. We all have to look at that. Yeah.
Well, that's very interesting that you put it that way, because you're absolutely correct. It's something that should interest everybody in this country, because as China seeks to expand in the Pacific, and the United States continues to protect and build a wall of sorts in the Pacific Ocean to protect us from China, the Chinese are now moving to the Caribbean and Central America, right? And we see that last year they had war games with Iran, Russia, in Venezuela. We have now hear of China trying to reopen the old Russian spy mission in Cuba to spy on the United States. And it seems that China tried to buy the nuclear submarine base in Puerto Rico, Rosie Roads, some years ago, by using a bunch of shell corporations until they figured it out and they shut it down. But China is getting very aggressive. So the national security of the country on the eastern side of the country is Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is the first sizable piece of land that we find coming from Europe, and China continues to invest in the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, now Colombia, now all the small little islands and the Leeward Islands of the Caribbean. So China is being very aggressive, and the United States needs to start protecting its eastern border, and Puerto Rico is its beachhead there.
Oh, one second, before I ask the last question for you, Jose, I want to first thank you very much for giving your time toward this podcast and your support of all the efforts that we have always done here in Central Florida on different various projects with the Bar Association. You've been your heart's always in the right place. I know I can always count on you. There is another question which I think is important, and that perhaps we can discuss somewhat in the future. But there are Puerto Ricans like of those 6 million Puerto Ricans floating around on the mainland. Most of them, if not at least half of them, were born here on the mainland, were not born on the island.
That's correct.
Yet we maintain that cultural ties. We speak Spanish. We go back and forth to the island, and but there's a lack of knowledge about the island. We say we're Puerto Ricans in New York. Puerto Rican because you go down to the parade, in June, you wave the flag, and you have a couple of bacalaitos, and you're Puerto Rican. But we don't know about Puerto Rico. We don't necessarily speak Spanish, and those that do speak Spanish speak it badly. But yet, queremos ser puertorriqueño. So there has to be a little bit more, and I'm thinking in the nature of this national platform. But I think Puerto Rico itself has a role, sort of like what Israel does when it brings legislators to Israel to see the danger that Israel encounters in its neighborhood. But there has to be something. And I dealt this question with the other presidents of the other bar associations about cultural ties, about learning about our history, about knowing much more about Puerto Rico than just the love that we have for it and singing happy birthday in Spanish. There has to be something so that we get to know who Muñoz Marín is and who Ferrea was and the history of the island, which we don't learn when you're raised in Chicago or New York or any place else. I was wondering if you had given any thought to this concept of the cultural, let's call it a divide or cultural lack of information that the mainlanders have with the actual island.
Yeah. So yeah, it's not only the Puerto Ricans living on the mainland. It's the other 220 million Americans living here who don't know anything about Puerto Rico. And for example, when we had the hurricanes and the earthquakes 5 years ago, it's sad, but one of the positives that came out of that is that people on the mainland learned about Puerto Rico. They figured, Puerto Rico is part of the United States. You're born a U.S. citizen. You don't need a passport to go to Puerto Rico. You're inside the U.S. Customs territory. So that helped people learn and become more curious. I mean, we have members of Congress that go to Puerto Rico and they write to me asking, what kind of money do I need to bring? Do I need to update my passport? Do I need a visa? Right. Just dumb things that members of Congress should know, right? That Puerto Rico is part of the United States. It's a territory of the United States. So the problem is big. It's a very important problem. It's something that has to be dealt with. But how you deal with it is an expensive proposition, right? Because you would have to create some kind of advertising campaign or something to educate people. Puerto Ricans, unfortunately, will have to depend on their parents to teach them about the things that they knew before they left the islands, because they're born in the mainland and never lived in Puerto Rico. Just go back for vacations, a week, once a year. So it's a hard thing to address, but opportunities arise. And we have to take those opportunities. The government of Puerto Rico should do a better job of informing and educating people in the mainland.
Yeah, I think that's one of the projects I think that I'm going to try to see how we can do with this platform of the lawyers who generally are more affluent than the rest of the community at large, can afford to go back to the island. And perhaps like New York, that has the Somos Conference that's celebrated every year in Puerto Rico, the New York State Legislature, that is. Perhaps we can do something that we can bring the lawyers from around the country to the island. And in that opportunity to discuss with our colleagues the law, we could also have an opportunity to see the culture firsthand and go to the different parts of the island. For myself, I stopped going to Puerto Rico just to vacation in la playa de Isla Verde, where my parents lived. where I started decided that I need to know about Puerto Rico, particularly after I got elected to Florida, to the legislature here in Florida. I said, "Man, I better know about this island, right?" And so I started going back to Puerto Rico on cultural tours, to touch the four corners, los faros de los cuatro esquinas de Puerto Rico. I wanted to learn about the Puerto Rico, travel its roads, learn about its people, know its culture and its history. And thus, my trips to Puerto Rico became political trips in order to better enhance the community that I was representing in Tallahassee, out of Washington, here in Florida. So, I think there's a role for us to do that, and that's a continuing effort in the long term. In the meantime, Jose, I want to thank you so much for joining us here in I Need to Know and the Public Trust Network. We're trying to do something here. Hopefully, it works out with the convention and the years to come. But we're hoping that if we can pull this off as a successful convention next year, it's a national election year, and perhaps we can pull in some national candidates, right, to come to our convention if we do it right. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, Toy, thank you for having me, and thank you for everything you do. You are definitely one of the stars in our effort in the United States to educate people and maintain the culture and teach people what we're all about and why it's so important that we get this status issue resolved one way or another. So thank you for everything you do and for your effort.
Bienvenido. Gracias.